Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Wallace here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm an evolutionary epidemiologist with the People's CDC, here with an update on the COVID-19 pandemic. This week, we'll cover the state of global COVID, the state of U.S. COVID, and revisit the cognitive dissonance being imposed on the American people, this time around the nature of COVID interventions, both here in the U.S. and in China. We begin with global COVID. In the graph in red, the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center reports us up to 3.15 million new confirmed COVID cases worldwide for the week ending November 27th. The number of global weekly deaths, there in white, is up to over 9,400 confirmed deaths this past week. In green, we see global vaccinations up to 19.7 million. This New York Times map shows hotspots over the past week globally. The U.S. shows an increase in average daily new cases per 100,000 population, as do Peru and Brazil. The surge in Europe continues to pulse, with a new increase in France, as well as Italy and Austria. Japan has surged back to a top tier in caseload, and Australia is showing another increase. Greece and New Zealand remain in the top tier. As we can see from these percent changes in caseloads the past couple weeks, rebounds there in the warm colors are still well distributed across the globe. We see new surges in the Western Hemisphere, including Peru, Brazil, Bolivia, and Argentina. In Europe, France and Czech Republic. Across Eurasia, Georgia, Iraq, Uzbekistan, China, Laos, and Cambodia. In Africa, we have Madagascar, Zambia, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Niger. At a time when most countries other than China have rolled back non-pharmaceutical interventions like mask mandates, clocking in at no more than 60% on the Containment and Health Index measuring such interventions. With Mexico, Great Britain, China, and parts of South America and Africa with no data reported this round. And at a time when the vaccine strategy many governments say they're pursuing instead of non-pharmaceutical interventions is failing. Much of the world is at best vaccinated for variants no longer circulating. We see uneven campaigns in booster vaccination across the world. On the one hand, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, Cuba, Canada, Belgium, Finland, Germany, Italy, Australia, and Japan showed top-tier booster campaigns, with 70 or more people boosted per 100 population. In contrast, we see near nothing in Russia, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, and those even reporting in from Africa, as well as mediocre campaigns in the U.S., Mexico, Brazil, China, and Eastern Europe. The CDC reports the U.S. at 12.7% of its eligible population 5 years and older with an updated booster dose. The collapsing vaccination campaigns, hand in hand with the rollback in the non-pharmaceutical campaigns that successful vaccination depends on, is occurring exactly when multiple Omicron subvariants are circulating across large expanses of the world. As of November 21st, we see in some of these countries subtyping their COVID samples, largely biased to more high-income countries. BA.5 still dominates, but is falling farther back as BQ1 across many countries and XBB, especially in Indonesia, are coming on stronger. BA.2.75 continues to fall away. Evolutionary virologist Moritz Gersten maps out a finer global distribution of subvariants, finding continued competition across BQ1, XBB, and BA.2.75 sublineages. He also reports that presently BQ1 sublineages are more prevalent in the Western Hemisphere, while XBB and BA.2.75 sublineages continue to dominate in the Eastern Hemisphere. The veritable zoo of new sublineages now circulating, here the offspring of BA.4 and BA.5, continues to proliferate, with new entries BW1.1, DJ1, BA5.2.42, CM2.1, and BQ1.1.25. Certainly a mouthful there. Many of the sublineages are converging on the same molecular adaptations or combinations of new amino acid replacements. Those in the circles, some from different subvariant parents, have developed molecular combinations that permit them resistance to monoclonal antibody treatments for COVID. And the same can be said for descendants of the BA.2 subvariant. Such evolution impacts disease control at 3 levels. Perna Arora and colleagues showed last episode that widespread sublineage BQ1.1 there on the far right is proving resistant to all commercial monoclonal antibodies, every single one. Other prevalent Omicron subvariants were shown to be resistant to almost all the treatments. That's particularly problematic for immunocompromised patients who do not mount a full adaptive response upon vaccination. Evolutionary virologist Thomas Peacock's group proposes that the various sublineages also diverge in their evolution, often into different molecular combinations that are likely to elicit poorly cross-reactive immune responses. That is, infection with one sublineage won't offer protection against the others. Yonglong Cao's group here showed that the 4 different molecular domains on the spike protein at the top here, with Omicron mutations in red, demonstrated different kinds of ways to escape antibody neutralization, with the mutations on the bottom left producing different levels of neutralization escape on the right. The larger the letter of the amino acid on the right, the larger its escape score. Secondly, the Peacock team proposes there's no guarantee that we'll continue on a path of antigenic or within lineage evolution within the Omicron subvariants. Any one of these sublineages could suddenly surge ahead to represent the next impunctuated evolution, far beyond our present population immunity or vaccine coverage, like starting over again with an entirely new COVID variant. Biostatistician Lauren Beasley and colleagues showed that subvariant success, which subvariants spread faster where, depends on local circumstances. The team conducted a retrospective analysis of SARS-2 sequences. They found subvariant success clustered in time and place across 215 global locales, clustering here into 7 zones on the left, based on their relative timing of new variants and their maximum prevalence there on the right. We see in the upper left that countries differed in how fast a predominant variant transitioned to the next one, and that these speeds differed by variants, with the more recent Omicron subvariants making these transitions faster than earlier variants like Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. In the lower left, we see the variants differed in the timing of their transition from earlier to later, with again the Omicron variants faster than Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. In the upper right, we see the variants differed in how varied they were in their genetic sequences, although they also differed in their range of variants. And finally, to give us some context, in the lower right, we see the dates of the variants' first emergence. What explains this variation? Beasley and colleagues showed it all is dependent on some of the underlying circumstances of a place upon a variant's arrival. Here are 2 results. On the top, the team shows by their random forest modeling, which accounts for complicated interactions between variables, that those variables listed on the left, population density, government response, mask use, vaccination, and the like, differed in how much excluding that variable contributed to increases in the mean square error for each of these 3 transition measures we discussed in the previous slide. So while excluding population density had little impact on the model at the top in blue, excluding vaccination down at the bottom had a big impact. On the bottom, the regression model the team ran showed vaccination rates, cumulative prior cases per million, population density, population age, the time since the last case wave peak, and the number of co-circulating variants were all significantly associated with variant transition dynamics after adjusting for other location characteristics and accounting for multiple testing. But what we see here is also dependent on which transitions. We see in the middle bottom there that vaccination impacted local transitions before Delta emerged and under Delta, but they did not impact them under the Omicrons. That is, vaccination did not slow the spread of local Omicrons. The team observes other characteristics. Quote, a higher number of co-circulating variants was strongly associated with slower and lower peak prevalence of new variants. A higher prior COVID-19 case rate per million, a shorter time since the last case wave peak, and lower population density were all significantly associated with later variant transitions. And finally, locations with higher proportions of the population over 65 tended to have higher peak variant prevalences. End quote. So it appears vaccination works to slow the spread of virus until it doesn't. Whether that's a result of viral evolution or the collapse in vaccination campaigns or both is, in my view, an open question. Tullio de Loveria's team, meanwhile, shows that any subvariant that evolves the magic combination that escapes such local constraints can make its way out anywhere else in short order. By phylogeographic inference, the team modeled where previous variants and subvariants likely originated and how they migrated around the world, with the speed and range of migration related to the volume of air travel. Turning to the U.S., we see from the Walgreens COVID-19 index that test positivity is approaching the Omicron peak of January 2022, with over a third of tests positive, including for both rapid tests and PCR. This New York Times map shows slight shifts in COVID cases per 100,000 population. The West Coast and Rockies up into Montana appear filling in again. The Four Corners remains an epicenter, but at lesser peak. The Plain States host pinpricks of outbreaks, especially most of Kansas, the Dakotas, and now Nebraska. Illinois appears to be hosting a new incursion. The South is starting to fill in again off a previous retraction, and New York City is starting up again. Here's a Health and Human Services map of inpatient bed availability. This includes for all patients, COVID and otherwise. The COVID Report Twitter account reported large increases in daily new COVID hospitalizations, including over 5,500 nationally on November 30th alone. In the weeks to come, the People's CDC will work to use HHS data to map COVID hospitalizations alone. But we see here large swaths of the U.S. with little bed availability, including up and down the West Coast, here in the Twin Cities regional area, and across the Rust Belt, the Northeast, and the Carolinas. Other modes of tracking COVID-19 are patchy at best, given uneven coverage. We see the levels of SARS-2 virus detected in the wastewater that comes through our sewage plants, in some ways a leading indicator of the pandemic. It shows eddies of increases and decreases. In blue, we see a cooled off Oregon, Missouri in part south. In reds and oranges, representing SARS-2 loads of 60 to 100% more than their previously recorded levels, we see Utah and Arizona hit hard, Nebraska, the upper Midwest, especially Ohio, and New York City. However, the more acute measure of changes in sewage loads over the past 15 days shows red flare-ups of 1,000% or more of SARS-2 detected across much of the country's sewage plants that are reporting in, including Seattle, Idaho, Utah, Nebraska, all across the upper Midwest, those stations that are reporting in from the south and along the northeast coast. The sewer shed surveillance project in Missouri models what we could have nationally, with nearly full coverage across the state. Testing this week shows no decreases and shows increases in St. Louis, Kansas City, and a few other plants. The project also tests for which variants show up where. Evolutionary virologist Mark Johnson reports that the BQ sublineages are beating out the XBBs in Missouri sewer sheds. To sum up, here's the People's CDC version of our present community transmission by county as of December 1st, mapped by our own Les Schaffer. This map shows the combo of caseloads and test positivity that the CDC plots, now reporting only once a week. But unlike the CDC, the People's CDC differentiates the high level of danger counties are subjected to beyond 10% COVID positivity into high, very high, and extremely high exposure. Down at the bottom, we see that the People's CDC also differentiates exposure by both the percent of counties and by the percent population. We see a slight rise in the floor of the pandemic here in the US. We see that by population, we're suddenly to nearly 60% of the American people in communities subjected to high to extremely high COVID exposure. Another 34% of the American people are subjected to substantial exposure. The South is rapidly filling in with more COVID, as are the Atlantic states centered around the New York City epicenter. The upper Midwest is also leveling up, particularly Indiana and Illinois. The Four Corners remains another epicenter, and Kansas is in our estimation, now an epicenter. In contrast, according to the CDC's favored indicator, community levels, much of the country is largely in the clear, at low levels in the green. Exactly the kind of measure the CDC's own recently published study indicates causes people to underestimate the COVID danger they are in. The study reported that, quote, 1/2 of adults surveyed during June to July 2022 who had recently received a positive SARS-2 test result in metropolitan Detroit and DuPage County, Illinois, perceived local COVID-19 transmission when surveyed to be low or moderate, despite documented sustained high transmission. Higher perceived local COVID-19 transmission was associated with more use of preventive behaviors overall and in response to high local COVID-19 transmission, end quote. So keeping up with what is actually the likely exposure appears to be important. We see here that alongside the winter surge the People's CDC warned about, the outbreak stateside continues to evolve, with the BA.5 and BA.4.6 variants continuing to be replaced by BQ1 and BQ1.1. XBB is starting to come on as well. There's more out there in the US's evolutionary soup, however. Here's the 15-day trend of all the genetic sequences of detected sublineages in the US as of December 1st, including their geographic origins. In New York City, lots of BQ.1, BQ1.1, and XBB, and now XBB 1.5. And we see in lavender the XBB that was only in New York City 2 weeks ago, diffusing, as we proposed last episode, to other locales, some nearby like New Jersey and Pennsylvania, but also by hierarchical spread to Florida and California. As we saw at the international level, multiple subvariants and sublineages are co-circulating together in the same locales, perhaps increasing the likelihood of recombination. That's why driving SARS-2's population under its rate of replacement remains an important and entirely viable public health target. Indeed, evolutionary virologist Thomas Peacock's group proposes XBB, toward the bottom here, to be just such a recombinant of BJ.1 and BA.2.75. With the soup in the previous slide, the combinatorials may not be total, not everything will combine with everything else, but the variation with which SARS-2 has at hand is ginormous and likely to put the virus ahead of whatever vaccine program we are understandably always going to be behind in. The Peacock team proposes not only such simple recombinants, but complex recombinants of multiple breakpoints and additional mutations along the lines of antigenic drift. The variants evolve out by their own by point mutations from one locale to another. We finish up the broadcast exploring the ideological uses of strategic omission and cognitive dissonance that we described in the previous COVID This Week episode. Indeed, as Professor of Medicine Walid Jalad commented on the CDC's own findings that showed that downgraded perceptions of COVID risk in actually high-risk areas selected for unsafe COVID behavior, quote, "I am flummoxed. This is from the CDC, who created the community levels map that signal all was well in the first place," end quote. At a time when the CDC is also still omitting mask usage in its COVID messaging in favor of hand washing and cough etiquette. Conflicting or incomplete messaging is found around vaccines. The mRNA vaccines work at the level that those vaccinated are less likely to get seriously sick or die. That said, they are no panacea, and the establishment is trying to come to terms with that, noting their increasing failure as a solitary public health intervention, and as the New York Times writes here, at the level of tactical choice. Should the latest booster have been bivalent, quote, having the Omicron-specific component of the new booster, undermining the shot's effectiveness? But days later, at presidential medical advisor Anthony Fauci's last press briefing before retirement, Biden's COVID brain trust doubled down on the present strategy, citing the effectiveness of the vaccine, quote, "As families gather for Thanksgiving, the coronavirus appears to be less of a threat to most Americans than it was a year ago, when Omicron began spreading infection at an alarming rate," end quote. As if the initial Omicron onslaught last winter, in which nearly 250,000 Americans died over 5 months, should serve as the baseline for evaluating the present status of the US response. The double standards are externalized abroad. Protests broke out across China, acutely in response to a fire in Urumqi, Xinjiang, that killed 10 people who protesters believed were locked down because of COVID. Authorities denied that, but the fire served to alight broader objection to China's zero COVID program. Certainly, people around the world should have the right to protest their governments, and no one should be forced to stay inside a burning building if that indeed happened, or die in a bus accident on their way to quarantine in the middle of the night, as occurred earlier in September in the city of Gaoyang in southwest China, which was also used to question zero COVID. Yes, an argument can be made that China should have better deployed vaccination, even if vaccines are no panacea, and even if a U.S. that refused to force American companies to distribute vaccines to the world for free or cheap is in no position to point fingers on that account. We should note that there have been other fires in China. A couple days ago, before the Urumqi fire, 38 people died at the Kashina trading factory in Anyang, a city in Henan province. It occurred in the kind of high-tech development zone that's studded across China, which the past 3 decades has been acting as the factory of the world. Should we be asking now about the labor arbitrage the U.S. and other global North countries play, passing off the labor and environmental damage of production upon China and other so-called Asian tigers? It's a good question. Never mind that. The U.S. establishment press has engaged in a ferocious feeding frenzy around zero COVID, largely organized around grandiose declarations about the need or likelihood of regime change. Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman's column on the matter is a good summary of 3 talking points that appeared in almost all these pieces. Like Biden officials earlier in the year, he presented the strength of China's COVID response as a weakness. China can't get back to normal life, as in the U.S., where thousands are still killed a week. Without a whit of irony or a global economic framework, he points out the workers fled the Foxconn plant making U.S. iPhones. He declares the autocratic governments can't admit mistakes or accept evidence it doesn't like, presuming letting millions die or get long COVID, as the U.S. accepts, to be the way forward. He declares flattening the curve, the first year, the way to go, an objective the U.S. never really pursued, but once vaccinations offered, non-pharmaceutical intervention should be abandoned, a position no serious public health practitioner outside U.S. minimizers supports. Autocracies make mistakes and democracies do not, he continued. No mention in the column of 1 million here killed by COVID. He writes that the Chinese weren't permitted the infections that lead to natural immunity, which we've presented here time and time again, does not keep a virus allowed to evolve resistance in millions of new cases a week from infecting people. Other talking points include the declaration the protests against zero COVID represent the greatest protests since Tiananmen Square. In actuality, there have been thousands, if not tens of thousands of protests in this time, largely work strikes and actions that the Chinese people themselves undertook. On top are the actions only since June mapped by China Labor Bulletin. Underneath are wildcat strikes in 2011 and 2018 for 2 other examples. The protests are often directed at the conditions of factories largely dedicated to producing goods for foreign companies or domestic operations dedicated to export. The very dangers the Paul Krugmans of the world wish China would return their workers to. The acrimony is so sharp and ungainly both that it doesn't seem to matter what China does. It is pummeled for its COVID success and related problems, and as we see in this Bloomberg piece, pummeled for letting up on zero COVID. China appears to be targeted on 2 accounts. There's the danger of acting as a mirror through which to see our own situation. We see both the difference in the number of cumulative COVID deaths between the U.S. and China, down there in red on the bottom, as well as the continuation of COVID deaths nearly 2 years into the Biden administration. If China had allowed a proportional number of deaths, it would have suffered 4.6 million COVID deaths. For the 3rd year running, COVID-19 represents the U.S.'s 3rd leading cause of death. And although there are infectious versions of nearly all these conditions, COVID-19 represents the sole one caused by a preventable pathogen. Mark and Charles Seisler show that even as the number of COVID deaths in the U.S. declined from 2020 to 2021, 3rd from the left in the top graph, with younger people dying, the number of years lived lost to COVID-19 there on the bottom surged ahead in 2021 beyond any other source of mortality, an outcome likely to be reproduced in 2022. Long story short, younger people are dying at a greater rate. For the living, entire weeks have been lost during the pandemic to health problems, childcare problems, or family obligations. Labor economist Aaron Sojourner reports that 2 million employees lost their entire week at the end of November this year, with, we'll add, almost no federal financial or public health help. A country largely abandoned. The failure to respond, dumping the worst of the public health load on healthcare staff, as we saw in our hospitalization map, has led to 1 in 5 healthcare workers quitting. Nurses have repeatedly attempted to intervene on their patients' behalf, demanding the staffing necessary to cover overloaded hospitals, even now 3 years into the pandemic. After a 3-day strike here in September, tapping the brakes to alert communities of their common needs, nurses here in Minnesota are prepping for a 3-week strike. They will be treated like the enemy. This week, we learned that against all the headlines, President Biden and a bipartisan Congress didn't avert a possible rail strike. They blocked the union from earning back their members more than a single sick day in a sector both dangerous and making record profits. Whether in public health or around workers' rights, it appears the greater population is not the political class's constituency. It took only a matter of days for the full force of the political class to organize against the rail unions, from far-right Republicans to the Squad. If rail is so important to the whole of the country, then its workers, whose staffing has been cut in half, need their sick days and more. That includes reversing work hour increases, reversing cost cutting, reversing automation, and reversing reduced crew sizes. Or is the objective to drive all essential work down to the level of treatment farm workers suffer, already an unforgivable situation? Indeed, the same arguments pitting workers and the economy, however much healthcare consumers require well-treated nurses to treat them well, are already being deployed against Minnesota nurses. For class war is the dominant order the world over, whether during strikes in China or in the U.S. As we described previously in Code this week, the global economy, or rather global profit, was under pressure even before the pandemic. And now, with supply lines still bottled up, inflation continuing and markets shaky, each center of capital is trying to leave the other holding the bag. That's the second reason China appears targeted. Geographer David Harvey described this as a standard in inter-imperial rivalry. Quote, at times of savage devaluation, interregional rivalries typically degenerate into struggles over who is to bear the burden of devaluation, end quote. COVID represents something more than just the epidemiological face of that rivalry. The virus has been deployed as a form of bioeconomic warfare. No country can end a pandemic alone. So when the world's neoliberal regimes refuse to do their part to drive SARS-2 under its rate of replacement, ready and willing to sacrifice their own citizens in the millions, they in effect place those countries that were trying to protect their people under siege. For 2 years, the minimizers dumped COVID-19 infected bodies over the other countries' town walls. And one by one, those recalcitrant countries fell to both the COVID onslaught of new variants and the objections of their exhausted citizens. New Zealand, Spain, Uruguay, Vietnam, Iceland, they all gave up. China was the last major holdout. That means atop climate change, COVID mortality will be the order of the decade, however quietly it is buried as an acute problem. The U.S. political class and its counterparts in other countries appear to have succeeded in making a death cult the global standard. We should refuse that ethos. It won't end well for any of us, here, in China, or anywhere else. And that's COVID this week from the People's CDC. You can learn more about the People's CDC and read this week's COVID weather report at our revamped website, peoplecdc.org.